I mean, if you look at a standard surveyor's map, there's this expectation of absolute precision, right? You see a solid black line, and the city points to it and says, there's your property and there's your neighbors.
Right. It's clean, it's binary.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It gives this comforting sense of order. But if you step off the land and into the South China Sea, those solid lines they completely vanish.
They do. It is the absolute definition of geopolitical muddy waters.
Yeah. So today we're diving into a territorial landscape that honestly holds over $3 trillion in global trade and this multi-billion-barrel gold mine right beneath the floorboards. Our mission for this deep dive is to map out the geopolitics, the economic stakes, and, well, the physical friction that makes this specific waterway probably the most likely spark for the next global conflict.
And, to understand the modern world, you really have to look at how nations behave in the oceans. What we are seeing here is an incredibly volatile mix of unexploited natural resources, legal ambiguity, and just deep, deep strategic anxiety. It's a combination that essentially forces us to question whether the future is going to be governed by international treaties or, just by whoever has the biggest guns.
Which is terrifying. And if you're listening to this and wondering why this matters to you, even if you live thousands of miles away from the Pacific, the economic and security ripples of this exact region directly dictate the cost of the supply chains you rely on.
Absolutely.
I mean, it affects the microchips in your phone, the fuel in your car, the consumer goods you buy every single day. So, okay, let's unpack this. Before we get into the conflict itself, we really need to understand the physical space and the prize at the center of it all.
Yeah, the scale is, it's the first thing you have to wrap your head around. We are talking about a geographic footprint on the western edge of the Pacific Ocean that covers more than 3 million square kilometers.
Wow, 3 million.
It's vast. And scattered across this massive expanse are hundreds of islets, atolls, partially submerged rocks. The primary features you hear about constantly are the Paracel Islands up in the north, the Spratly Islands down in the south, and the Scarborough Shoal off the eastern edge.
3 million square kilometers is almost hard to visualize, but I mean, the water itself is just the medium, right? It's what's moving on top of it that matters first. A full 1/3 of all global maritime shipping passes through the South China Sea.
Right.
That is over $3 trillion in trade moving through those waters annually.
And as global economic gravity really shifts heavily toward the Indo-Pacific, that traffic is only increasing. I mean, it is the central artery for global commerce. If that artery gets severed, the global economy basically suffers a massive heart attack.
It's like owning the only toll bridge connecting two massive economies, except in this case, someone discovered that the pillars holding up the bridge are resting directly on top of, a gold mine.
Yeah, that is exactly the dynamic. What's fascinating here is that the seabed contains massive, though largely unexploited, hydrocarbon reserves. Now, estimating exactly how much is down there, that varies wildly depending on who is doing the geological surveying.
Right. There is a staggering variance in the numbers in the source material. One estimate puts reserves at 13 trillion barrels of natural gas and roughly 16 to 33 billion barrels of unexplored oil. But then you look at other geological assessments in the same reports, and they estimate 7 billion barrels of oil and 900 trillion cubic feet of gas. Why is there such a massive gap?
Well, underwater surveying is notoriously difficult to begin with, but those numbers are also highly politicized.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, because claiming a massive untapped reserve helps justify the enormous military expenditure required to secure it. But regardless of which estimate you trust, the wealth is undeniable. And alongside those hydrocarbons, you have some of the richest fishing grounds on Earth.
Which is huge for the local populations.
It's exactly. For the surrounding nations with booming populations, those marine resources aren't just an economic bonus, Securing them is a matter of basic food security and national survival.
So you have a $3 trillion highway sitting on a multi-billion barrel energy reserve and a critical food supply. Naturally, every country in the region is going to want to draw a circle around it and claim it.
Oh, absolutely.
Which is exactly what happened, right? The map is just a chaotic web of overlapping claims. Let's transition to the root causes here. Who says they own what?
It is incredibly messy. The most expansive and contentious claim comes from China, utilizing something called the 9-dash line, or sometimes the 9-dot line.
Right.
And it's exactly what it sounds like, a literal series of dashes drawn on a map issued by the Chinese government back in 1949, claiming almost the entirety of the sea based on ancient historic rights.
But wait, if China signed the United Nations Convention on the Laws of the Sea and CLS in 1982, How do they mentally justify pointing to a loosely marked sketch from 1949? I mean, that makes absolutely no legal sense in a modern framework.
Legally, it doesn't align with UNCLOS, no. UNCLOS establishes very clear maritime boundaries, known as exclusive economic zones or EEZs.
Right, those extend 200 nautical miles from a country's coastline, right?
Exactly, 200 nautical miles. But China argues that UNCLOS shouldn't retroactively erase what they consider their historic rights to these waters and islands.
But China is surrounded by neighbors who also signed that 1982 UN Celeste Treaty and expect it to be honored.
Right, so you have the Philippines, which issued a presidential decree in 1978 asserting its claim, and they currently occupy several of the Spratly Islands. You have Malaysia, which defines its continental shelf based on a 1979 map. You have Vietnam fiercely contesting the Paracel Islands with China.
It's crowded.
Very.
Yeah.
You have Brunei and Taiwan, heavily involved in the overlapping claims, especially down in the Spratlys. Every single one of these claims intersects.
So the fundamental problem here is that China's nine-dash line essentially swallows the internationally recognized maritime boundaries of Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia, Taiwan, and Brunei.
Yes, all of them.
And this tension couldn't just exist on paper forever. That brings us to the trigger event. In 2013, the Philippines essentially said, enough is enough, and took China to an international arbitral tribunal under Annex 7th of the UNCLS framework.
Right. The Philippines argued that China's historic rights claim was completely incompatible with the 1982 convention that both countries signed. And in July 2016, the tribunal delivered its verdict. They ruled decisively against China's maritime claims.
Which really exposes the fundamental flaw of international maritime law, right? A
Yeah.
court ruling means absolutely nothing without a police force to back it up, because China didn't just ignore the ruling, they refused to even participate in the hearings.
Correct. Beijing's official stance is that the tribunal had no jurisdiction, the ruling is quote-unquote null and void, and they will only resolve these disputes through bilateral negotiations.
Meaning one-on-one talks with the other claimant.
Exactly.
And the mechanism behind that strategy is obvious. It's a divide-and-conquer approach. If China sits down one-on-one with a much smaller country like Brunei or the Philippines, China has overwhelming diplomatic, economic, and military leverage. They absolutely do not want an international court leveling the playing field.
That is the precise strategic logic. Bilateral talks maximize China's inherent size advantage. And because international law basically proved to be a paper tiger in 2016, China realized it didn't need to win the argument in a courtroom. Instead, they decided to change the physical geography of the sea itself.
Right. If the paperwork fails, pour concrete.
Exactly.
But to understand why China is going to such extreme, expensive lengths to physically secure these waters, we really have to look at what drives their geopolitical anxiety, the strategic motivations.
Yeah, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it boils down to something strategists call the Malacca dilemma.
The Malacca dilemma.
Right. China is an economic juggernaut, obviously, but it is heavily dependent on energy imports from West Asia. The oil and gas they need to keep their factories running and their cities lit have to travel by ship.
And those ships have to pass through a series of geographical bottlenecks.
Precisely. Sea lanes of communication that squeeze through very narrow, highly vulnerable choke points, most notably the Malacca Strait, along with the Sunda and Lombok Straits.
So if a conflict were to break out, a rival power like, say, the United States, could simply park a few naval destroyers at the Malacca Strait, blockade the shipments, and completely choke off China's energy supply. I mean, industry halts, the economy stalls, the military runs out of fuel.
It is an existential vulnerability for them. China knows that as long as their navy is restricted to coastal defense, they are at the mercy of whoever controls those straits. Therefore, pushing out into the deep oceans isn't just about national pride. It's a structural necessity.
They need a bigger reach.
Exactly. They are rapidly developing a blue water navy, a force capable of operating globally, far beyond their own shores, to secure those supply chains.
Which directly challenges the historical dominance of the U.S. Navy in the Pacific.
It does. The Indo-Pacific has become the primary arena for superpower competition. China views the U.S.'s pivot to Asia strategy as an attempt at containment, and their counter-strategy is to achieve extensive naval domination over the Indian and Pacific Oceans, push U.S. influence out of their backyard.
Here's where it gets really interesting, mechanically speaking. The mechanism they are using to achieve that dominance, they aren't just building a massive fleet of ships, they are literally building islands.
Yes.
If you look at satellite imagery of the region from 10 years ago versus today, the transformation is just staggering.
The militarization of the South China Sea is, frankly, one of the most aggressive geopolitical engineering feats of the modern era.
Yeah.
China has taken what were essentially just submerged coral reefs and rocks, dredged up millions of tons of sand from the seabed, and piled it on top to create artificial islands.
We are talking about 20 outposts in the Paracel Islands and 7 in the Spratlys. And these aren't just sandbars with a flag on them. Look at places like Subi, Mischief, and Fiery Cross Reefs.
Fiery Cross is the prime example.
Yeah, they built 27 acres of solid infrastructure on it, including a 3,000-meter runway.
And a runway of that length can facilitate operations for bombers, fighter jets, heavy military transport aircraft. These artificial islands are fully equipped with deep water access channels for warships, helipads, advanced radar facilities, and sophisticated missile emplacements.
It's brilliant in a very dark way. They build an unsinkable aircraft carrier fleet right in the middle of the world's busiest shipping lane. By putting runways and missiles on these roofs, they established physical military control where legal control was explicitly denied to them by The Hague.
That is power projection in its purest form. It extends their defensive perimeter outward and secures those vital energy routes by establishing facts on the ground, or in this case, facts on the water.
Okay, so the local nations are outmatched, and the U.S. is trying to maintain its Pacific presence. But another major stakeholder is deeply invested here, one that doesn't even share a coastline with the South China Sea: India. Let's talk about the impact on India.
Right.
If you, as a listener, are wondering why a country in South Asia cares about a dredged reef thousands of miles away, I want to ask you a quick active recall question. Remember those trillions of dollars in trade we mentioned at the start?
That's exactly why India is involved. Their involvement is driven by a blend of economic reliance and strategic balancing. Economically, India operates under the Act East policy, which focuses on deepening ties with the ASEAN nations, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and other Far Eastern economies.
Right. If you were India, your future economic growth relies heavily on those eastern markets. If China controls the South China Sea and can arbitrarily hinder regional trade or block commercial vessels, India's supply chains are directly threatened.
Exactly. The region functions as part of the Asian Commons, and India is very focused on concepts like Atmanirbhar Bharat and securing tech and energy supply chains. They can't afford a disruption there. But beyond the economics, India views the South China Sea as the ultimate litmus test for international maritime law.
Meaning, if a major power can simply ignore UNCLOS and seize an entire sea by force without consequence, the whole rule-based global order starts to unravel.
Precisely. That is why India made a point to strongly support the 2016 Hague Tribunal's verdict. They're using their diplomatic weight alongside forums like the QID to advocate for freedom of navigation and commercial access. They recognize the threat of Chinese expansionism and the resulting power asymmetry in Asia.
But they are playing a delicate game, right? India wants to restore the strategic balance in maritime Asia and prevent China from establishing complete hegemony, but they also want to maintain strategic autonomy and avoid inciting a direct military conflict. It's strategic balancing without formally locking into a military alliance.
It's a very pragmatic approach to a highly volatile situation. You want multipolarity, not a bipolar standoff.
Which brings us from the macro strategy down to the actual sparks flying on the water today, because all this history, legal maneuvering, and island building are resulting in physical confrontations between coast guards right now. Let's look at the Scarborough Shoal.
Yeah, the Scarborough Shoal is a triangular chain of reefs and rocks located roughly 200 kilometers off the coast of the Philippines. It is well inside the Philippine EZ. It's highly prized for its rich marine life and a lagoon that offers vessels a safe haven during typhoons. However, following a tense standoff in 2012, China effectively seized control of it.
And the political whiplash that followed is fascinating. The former Philippine president, Rodrigo Duterte, heavily pivoted toward Beijing. He essentially had a secret understanding with China that allowed Filipino fishing boats to continue operating near the shoal in exchange for diplomatic silence on the sovereignty issue.
But foreign policy can shift rapidly with a new administration. Under the current Philippine leadership, that dynamic has completely unraveled.
Oh, completely.
The Philippines has taken a much firmer stance, and in response, China has flooded the zone with its Coast Guard, blocking Filipino access.
And the fear is that China will eventually dredge the Scarborough Shoal and build another military base, just like they did at Fiery Cross. If they do that, they complete a strategic triangle of military outposts that gives them near total control of the sea.
Right.
And the Philippines is actively pushing back. We aren't just seeing diplomatic protests anymore. We are seeing kinetic friction.
The situation at the Second Thomas Shoal is perhaps the most vivid example of this. In 1999, the Philippines intentionally ran a rusted World War II-era tank landing ship, the Sierra Madre, aground on the reef.
Wow.
Yeah, and they kept a small detachment of Marines stationed on this deteriorating ship to serve as a physical sovereign outpost.
So, what does this all mean on the ground? Or on the water, I should say. It is an incredible image. A decaying ship marooned on a reef, acting as a geopolitical fortress. And China's Coast Guard vessels constantly circle it, using water cannons and aggressive blocking maneuvers to stop the Philippines from resupplying those Marines.
They're essentially trying to starve them out so the ship falls apart and China can claim the reef.
And the friction is escalating. Recently, the Philippines discovered that China's Coast Guard had installed a 300-meter-long ball buoy barrier near the Scarborough Shoal to block access. In a very bold move, the Philippine Coast Guard executed a special operation, approached the barrier, and literally cut the anchor lines, removing it.
It's physical sabotage of a sovereign blockade. China's foreign ministry naturally told the Philippines to stop provoking them. But what makes these skirmishes so terrifying is a legal change China made back home.
Yeah, let's talk about the institutional dimensions of that.
In February 2021, Beijing implemented a new Coast Guard law. This legislation officially authorizes China's Coast Guard to use quote-unquote all necessary means, including lethal force, to protect its resources within waters it claims jurisdiction over.
That's a massive shift.
It is. And crucially, they classify fishing and oil exploration as economic activities that require armed protection.
All necessary means. I mean, that is a legislative blank check for escalation. When a Coast Guard is authorized to act like a Navy, the line between a policing action and an act of war completely blurs. So, with buoys being cut and water cannons firing, is there any diplomatic off-ramp for the future here?
The primary attempt at an off-ramp is the ASEAN-China Code of Conduct, or the COC. The intent here is to establish a binding set of rules to prevent these exact skirmishes from escalating. But the initial decision to draft this code was actually made in 2002.
2002. They have been trying to agree on basic maritime manners for over 2 decades, and it's still not done. Why is it so hard to finalize? Let's break down those implementation challenges.
Well, because the underlying mechanisms of the dispute prevent consensus. Recently, due to the escalating clashes, they set a hard deadline to finalize the Code of Conduct by 2026.
Okay, a 2026 deadline.
But the massive hurdles remain. First, you have a fractured ASEAN.
Right. ASEAN operates on consensus. If one member vetoes a statement, the whole bloc stays silent. And China utilizes that leverage brilliantly, don't they? They offer massive infrastructure investments or trade deals to individual member states, like Cambodia, for instance, in exchange for those states blocking any unified ASEAN action that criticizes China.
It paralyzes the bloc. Beyond the internal divisions, you have disputes over the geographical scope. The South China Sea is a global common, so a code of conduct theoretically needs to align with global platforms. China, however, wants to limit the geographic scope and keep outside powers out of the agreement.
Then there is the legal alignment. The international community demands that any code must align with UNCOS. But as we established, China's core claim, the 9-line, violates UNCOS. You just cannot write a functional rulebook when the players fundamentally disagree on where the boundaries of the field are.
Exactly. And even if they manage to agree on the text by 2026, what is the legal status? China wants a gentleman's agreement focused on bilateral resolutions. Nations like the Philippines and Vietnam demand a legally binding document with a strict monitoring mechanism and a dispute settlement body. Without teeth, the Code of Conduct is just another piece of paper.
Which, leads to the ultimate geopolitical risk. Let's say you're writing a 150-word answer framework for an exam on why this is so dangerous.
Right.
You'd want to structure it around the 2026 deadline and the escalation risk.
Absolutely. An intro body conclusion format. You introduce the geographic and economic stakes. The body focuses on the militarization and legal failures like the 2016 ruling. And the conclusion centers on the impending risk of military engagement.
Exactly. Because if 2026 arrives and there is no binding code of conduct, what happens if one of these physical skirmishes goes too far? What if a Philippine Coast Guard vessel is sunk or lives are lost? Because the Philippine Coast Guard is massively under-equipped compared to China's, but they have a trump card.
They have a mutual defense treaty with the United States.
Right, a treaty dating back to 1951, which states that an armed attack on Philippine armed forces, public vessels, or aircraft in the Pacific would trigger a U.S. military response.
That is the ultimate tripwire. This raises an important question, right? This is why both sides heavily utilize Coast Guard vessels and maritime militia rather than gray-hulled Navy warships. It is known as gray zone tactics, operating aggressively just below the threshold of open warfare.
But if an incident crosses that threshold,
The United States is treaty-bound to intervene, potentially drawing two nuclear-armed superpowers into a direct shooting war.
it is a staggering amount of tension balanced on the edge of a knife. Okay, let's do a rapid revision recap to lock down the causal chain of everything we just covered. A final revision capsule. We started with the geography, 3 million square kilometers, holding $3 trillion in annual trade and massive unexploited energy reserves.
Right, and that immense wealth, combined with China's Malacca dilemma, their structural vulnerability to having their energy imports blockaded, drove Beijing to assert sweeping control using the historical yet legally ambiguous nine-dash line.
Then, when the Philippines challenged that claim in 2013, leading to the 2016 Hague Tribunal, the court ruled decisively that the nine-dash line violated modern international law, specifically UNCLOS. But without an enforcement mechanism, the ruling changed nothing.
So China bypassed the legal failure by altering the physical geography, dredging coral reefs into massive, fully militarized artificial islands like Fiery Cross, capable of projecting air and naval power across the entire sea.
This expansion forced regional powers like India to step in diplomatically, using policies like Act East to balance the scales and protect their own economic supply chains without inciting war. And it drove the Philippines to physically push back at places like the Second Thomas Shoal with the Sierra Madre and the Scarborough Shoal.
Leaving us in a very precarious present where coast guards clash over rusted ships and floating barriers enabled by China's 2021 Coast Guard law. And everyone is racing against a 2026 deadline to draft a code of conduct, with the 1951 U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty acting as the ultimate red line.
What becomes incredibly clear is that the South China Sea is not just a regional dispute over fishing rights and shipping lanes. It is a live stress test for the future of the global order. It's the whole geoeconomics to security pipeline.
It asks the fundamental question: will international law and treaties actually govern state behavior, or are we returning to an era where sheer military presence and physical control dictate the rules?
We began this deep dive by talking about the comfort of a surveyor's map. But out on the water, lines on a map are entirely imaginary unless someone is willing to risk everything to enforce them. So, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. Climate change and actively melting ice and opening up entirely new, highly lucrative maritime routes and unexploited resources globally, particularly up in the Arctic.
Oh, yeah.
As those new oceans open for business, will the muddy, militarized waters of the South China Sea become the blueprint for how superpowers carve up the globe? Or will the tension here serve as the terrifying cautionary tale that finally forces the world to universally respect a unified rule of law?
The way the South China Sea is resolved will cast a very long shadow over the geopolitics of the next century.
Until next time, keep looking beyond the map.